Hi everyone, this is Ted. I'm just going to go through the second part of chapter 3 with you. So let's go through the answers together. All right, so question 1. What can teachers do to motivate students? So there are many different things that students, so what the research tells us is that teachers can have a huge effect in motivating their students to improve in language learning and ability. So I think the first point that How Languages Are Learned mentions is about the inter, inter the relationship that teachers have with students, or the way that they're teaching. So they should teach in a way that is stimulating or that arouses curiosity. I think it's also an important part of the language teacher to make students understand that they need to be independent learners. They need to study on their own. That just studying within the classroom is not enough for them to improve in second language learning. And I think that teachers need to also state the communicative purpose of each activity that they do, so that students know what they're doing. I think too often teachers say, "Just do what I'm telling you to do," and then they don't explain why or the importance of why they're doing what they're doing. And students are more motivated when they think that what they're doing is helping them improve. The second point on what teachers can do to motivate students is to encourage parent and group participation. So if you've been in my classes, you know that I do a lot of interaction between students to get them to talk with each other. Students generally find it interesting to talk to each other more than just sitting there and listening to the teacher talk. And this isn't just a class about transferring knowledge. Language learning is about interaction in the community. You have to practice what you learn. So encouraging parent group participation is a huge motivator for students, because not only does it help them practice, but it gives them a chance to apply the skills that they're learning from the teacher. So in that sense, the design of activities for students should be those that make students think, that they enjoy, that they're challenged by, but not too challenged by. Remember, if you provide activities that are too challenging for students, they might not be able to do them, and they'll get frustrated and want to quit. And if they're too easy for students, then they might not be interested by them or stimulated by them. One way that I found that encourages students to participate is by making it competitive. Now, it's good to have a kind of a game, but you also don't want to make it too competitive, because some students who don't like competing might give up for that reason as well. But if you can just make it individually competitive for students, make some kind of game out of it. And I think it's okay to reward students for doing well, but I think you should make it competitive in a way that anyone can win, not just the best students will always win, because that will demotivate some of the lower level students. And then, of course, the teacher has to encourage the students through positive feedback by saying, "Hey, he did really well on that. Good job." As a parent and as a teacher, I think it's really important to tell people when they're doing well and why they're doing well. And I think, it might be also good to tell people when they're not doing well. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to make a mistake, that every mistake you make is an opportunity to learn. So I think both positive and negative feedback, when it's accurate, and, I think it's also important to let students know that positive feedback is good, but it's not the end of the world. It's not, just because you do something one time good doesn't mean you're always going to be good. And negative feedback isn't that important either. It's just like, oh, it's a chance to improve, let's move on. So don't make a huge deal about it. So these are 4 ways that things that teachers can do to, or fields or areas that teachers can do to improve the motivation of their students. Okay, what about group affiliation of Japanese L2 learners? Well, in general, Japanese students, based on their education, tend to really like clear-cut activities, grammar-based, and filling in the blanks or matching vocabulary. And these are good to a certain extent, but they're good for learning, but they're not good for practice. So I found as a teacher that Japanese students aren't as comfortable discussing things. They don't really know the clear-cut rules of discussion. And also, Japanese students don't want to appear too eager to volunteer to answer questions because they don't want to stand out. So there's a little bit of embarrassment. It's like I don't want to be a super keen English speaker because they're afraid the other students might judge them. So, you can break that barrier by giving students reasons to respond. If you say, hey, look, if you respond, I'm going to give you a higher score, so that, the students know that, communicating actively will get them a higher score. Well, that gives them, motivation to communicate, but it also gives them an excuse. I'm not bragging. I'm doing this for my score. So I'm not standing on. There's a purpose behind with it. Overall, lower level students tend to like clear-cut activities that have start and finish times, and this is the goal. And if you explain it to them, then they'll participate. And then as the student level gets higher, you can be more general or more open-ended, saying like discuss these issues. So like I try to gauge the open-endedness of the activities by the level of the students that I have. For example, in a discussion activities, if the students are having trouble discussing issues, I might put some hints on the board. You can use these questions, and then eventually kind of remove those questions so that they can have a natural conversation. Or if it's a very low level class, the activity might just be ask this question and answer this in this exact way, or dialogue practice where it's like perfect memory, where they know exactly what they do to finish the activity. But then a higher level class would be like discuss what you think about this and what you think we should do, which is very open-ended, and higher level students might be able to handle it. So as a teacher, you're constantly adjusting the level of difficulty to match the level of the activity to match the level of the student. What about the expectations of L2 learners from their teachers? Well, I think that there's the expectation of a lot of language learners that they want their teachers just going to be like, the teacher's going to correct every mistake I make, and then I'm going to learn through the correction of every mistake that I make. But it's been my experience, and the research supports this, that when teachers just like hammer all the mistakes that students make, the students can't communicate anymore because there's so many of them. And that actually it's counterproductive, because students need to be able to practice in a way. And to be honest, do you really need to be speaking 100% perfectly in order to make yourself understood? To be honest, most non-native speakers, if you talk to French people or German people who are speaking English, or Russian people who have a very high level of ability, they still make these tiny errors that don't really matter to meaning. They're just grammatically incorrect. So what the research tells us is that teachers should more strategically correct their students, saying things like, hey, Hiroki, I noticed that, Hiroki is my example student. I always use the same example name. Hiroki, I noticed that in our conversations, you often make this one mistake, and this is actually incorrect, and I think you should try not to use that in the future, because it will help you improve in your fluency. So then, by pointing out one or two errors, the student knows what to focus on to fix it, and instead of like pointing out 50 errors, and then the students just they can't internalize or remember any of the things you said the next time they speak. Now remember that communication is a very unconscious activity, and so when you're giving feedback, you're giving them conscious instruction, and the students consciously understand the correction, but they need practice to maybe put that into unconscious behavior, because the act of communicating in English is unconscious, because it has to be very quick, and so you correct their mistakes, and then you have them consciously correct them at first, and if they correct themselves enough times, hopefully that'll become unconscious later. What about the age in the L2 language learning? Well, there's this theory of a critical period, that the younger a learner is, the better they are going to be able to become fluent in the L2. But I think there's kind of a lot of a misunderstanding of the critical period. Like they say, oh, it's at age 12, and again, we think it's just basically it's a slow decay. As you get older, you get less kind of able to, you're just not as good at learning a second language. And so the older you start, the more challenging it tends to be for people. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It means you might have to work harder or study in a different way. Overall, younger learners tend to just absorb language more easily. They kind of absorb it unconsciously. But as you get older, you kind of require more conscious instruction in order to learn it. And so most of the students who study English as a second language start in junior high school or elementary school, and they need conscious instruction, but they also need practice in order to make that conscious acquisition unconscious, so that they can use it in a timing, meaningful way. So what is this, the suggestion about the critical period for language learning suggest about L2 instruction? Well, there's this idea that the younger the better, the younger you start learning, the better, but that applies to immersion, okay? So if you are studying every day, the younger the better is maybe a good philosophy. But they're doing that in Japan now. They're starting to study English younger and younger, but they're only studying like once or twice a week, and so there's not a lot of research to support the younger the better philosophy applies to language learning and education when you are only studying once or twice a week, because exposure to language, a high degree of exposure to language is really, really important at a young age. Otherwise, I'm not sure how valuable it is. And the other thing is, I know the younger the better, philosophy is pretty entrenched in the Japanese education system. There's this kind of, we want to be perfect. We want everyone to be perfect in English, but it's not really realistic. Most countries that have a good, that have good L2 language instruction, they're not that concerned about, perfect fluency. They're saying, functional. Should our goal as a society in Japan to say we want everyone to speak English perfectly, or we want to be able to make ourselves understood in a meaningful way. So, functional as opposed to fluent is maybe a different goal that maybe should be thought about more, because it would be a much easier goal to attain and require fewer resources and more realistic. When you set a goal that is impossible to reach, then basically everyone suffers. What advantages do older learners have over younger learners? Well, for the most part, younger learners learn language more comprehensively and faster over the long term than older learners. They say in the first 6 months, older learners tend to be faster than younger learners because older learners tend to be more motivated, and conscious instruction in the beginning is helpful. But to reach a high degree of fluency, younger learners definitely have advantages. So the advantages that older learners do have is that in the early stages, especially when there's limited contact, in the first 6 months, they do tend to be better, learn quicker, more quickly than younger learners do. And I think that not always, but in many cases, older learners who are studying by themselves or studying by their own choice tend to have a higher level of motivation. Now, this could be because they have a purpose. I'm an older learner. I want to learn a second language because I want to speak to people in another country, or because I need it for my work. Well, that's a very clear goal. Whereas some younger learners, they didn't choose to learn a second language. Their parents wanted them to, and so they're just there. So they might not be that motivated because they don't really understand why they're doing it. So those are two advantages that older learners. When I say older learners, I don't mean like 50-year-olds. I mean 18-year-olds or anyone that is older than somebody, say over 12 years old, that might be studying a second language by their own choice.